Who is Jordan Peterson?
Well, I'm a clinical psychologist and a professor, and I'm doing that on a broader scale now, I suppose. But it's an extension of what I've done since 1987, really. I mean, I taught the same things I'm teaching, although I've expanded them all throughout my academic career, and my classes were very popular. The students found them extremely useful.
Why have you become so notorious?
I got tangled up in a political controversy in Canada. I mean, tangled up. I put my foot in it to some degree because I wasn't very happy with what I regarded as government overreach in relationship to who is in possession of my tongue. And I decided a long time ago, and really a long time ago, that I was going to say what I thought and sort of independent of the outcome. And then I'm going to assume that whatever the outcome is the right outcome because it was based on something approximating the truth.
Ultimately, what is your goal?
You know, I want to say what I believe to be true as clearly and carefully as I possibly can, and I want to see what happens as a consequence. And what people don't understand about that in some sense is your happiness, the purpose of your life is not going to be happiness. Sometimes it is, sometimes that will come, but there will be difficult periods in your life, and happiness won't suffice then. But what you can have in your life is an adventure. You can have an adventure. And the truth is the best adventure. There's no doubt about that. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is you don't know what's going to happen if you say what you think. Now, I don't mean incautiously, and I don't mean provocatively or any more than necessary. You don't know what's going to happen. So that's very adventurous. But also, if it's you and your voice, then it's your adventure. And if it isn't, like if you're crafting your speech or manipulating in any way, or parroting or abiding by the dictates of the crowd, then I don't know whose adventure you're having, but it's not yours.
On free speech, it seems to me, in my 57 years of being on this planet, that free speech has never been under more ferocious attack, not in places you would expect, like authoritarian regimes, but actually in democracies. I never thought I'd come to a day in my lifetime where people were literally being fired or in some cases imprisoned for expressing honestly held opinions, even if I find those opinions grotesquely wrong or offensive.
You know, it's worse than that. People underestimate the significance of this because it isn't, we're not having a fight about who has the right to speak freely. That's nothing. That's a peripheral problem, even though that can be serious in and of itself. We're having a fight about whether or not your claim that free speech exists is nothing but a masquerade for your willingness to dominate and use power. And so if I was taking that tack, I'd say, it's all well and good for you to speak about free speech, but look, you're white and you're middle class and you're British and you're privileged, and you have this theory about free speech that your ancestors derived, but the only reason they ever derived that to begin with is so they could exercise their power. There's no such thing as free speech. That's just a lie to mask a power claim. And that's a way worse cynical criticism of the notion of free speech than you can't speak because I don't agree with
I mean, it's a form of fascism, isn't it? I mean, these people...
It's worse than that.
The ultra woke brigade out there, they categorize themselves as liberals, but there's nothing liberal about that mentality. When you have a cancel culture, which is driven by, if you don't agree with what I say, you're going to get shamed, vilified, cancelled, fired, maybe even imprisoned. That is actually what fascist regimes do to people, to their populace.
Yeah, but the fascists are more straightforward about it because they basically come out and say something like, shut up or we'll beat you.
Right.
Whereas the compassionate types who are narcissistic compassionate types, they come out and say, well, we're really trying to save the world, you know, and we're acting in everyone's best interest, and we think it would be better if you should just, you know, regulate what you say, because if you don't, you're not a good person. And so it's much more, I'd take the fascist bully over the compassionate narcissist anytime. They're way more straightforward.
I mean, we live again in an era where the hashtag be kind almost invariably is used by people who are the least kind people I think I've ever encountered.
Well, kindness is tricky, you know, because one of the things you deal with very commonly if you're a clinical psychologist, apart from depression and anxiety, is, well, behavior therapists offer assertiveness training. And now, the people who need assertiveness training are often people who are too agreeable, compassionate, polite by temperament. Now, the problem with that is that they let people walk all over them because they don't stand up enough for themselves. And the consequence of that is they get resentful, and then they get bitter, and then they get conniving, and then they'll mob. And so, because they'll do anything for everyone else, but they push themselves beyond their limits, and then they won't even recognize the limits because they feel, well, if I'm not doing everything for you, then I'm not a good person. It's like, no, a good person does a little for you. Like if I'm acting properly with you, say in this conversation, there's something in it for you, and there's something in it for me, right? And we want that to be reciprocal. And so the cost of me bending too far in your direction is that I'll become bitter and resentful and conniving. And resentment is an unbelievably toxic state of being.
Let me ask you about kids. By kids, I mean young adults, really, and then into their 20s, trying to form their way through life. One of my favorite movie clips is Rocky Balboa, who's probably the non-intellectual version of Jordan Peterson in many ways, because he said this to his son, who was getting a bit spoiled and entitled and moaning about being Rocky's son and so on. And he says this to him.
Let me tell you something you already know. The world ain't all sunshine and rainbows. It's a very mean and nasty place, and I don't care how tough you are, it will beat you to your knees and keep you there permanently if you let it. You, me, or nobody is gonna hit as hard as life. But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward. That's how winning is done. Now, if you know what you're worth, now go out and get what you're worth. But you gotta be willing to take the hits and not pointing fingers saying you ain't where you wanna be because of him or her or anybody. Cowards do that, and that ain't you. You're better than that.
I love that speech.
Yeah, it's good.
What do you think of it?
Well, that ethos was what lifted up Sylvester Stallone to stardom very rapidly with his first movie. And what do I think about that? I think that young people are literally dying for that message. I mean literally, they're so demoralized, it's just beyond belief. And so one of the things that's been painful about what I've been doing with my wife as we've traveled around the world for the last number of years is to see how desperate people are for an encouraging word.
This idea that actually your life is defined not so much by success, because you're everyone's friend when you're successful, but by the knocks you inevitably are going to get, whether it's through losing loved ones, losing a job, losing a car, whatever it may be. You're going to get hit by blows in your life of differing magnitude. And I've always believed that how you deal with the downside of life really defines how you lead the rest of your life.
Well, the clip is very interesting because it starts out with the admission that life is brutally difficult and sometimes unbearably brutally difficult. And you can see the progressives playing with that notion. It's warped into this sense of victimization, but it does reflect some understanding of the underlying tragic reality of life. And so it's good to get that right out on the table to begin with. Say, well, you're miserable, you have your reasons. And they might be deep reasons. But if you let the misery demoralize you and make you bitter and cynical and cowardly and make you withdraw, then first of all, that's a failure in the highest sense on your part, and all it's going to do is make everything worse. And then you might think, well, what do you have to respond to that? How do you respond to that catastrophe and challenge? And the answer is, and this is what Rocky is telling his son in no uncertain terms, is like, terrible as things are, there's a lot more to you than you can possibly imagine. And that if you face those things forthrightly and with some faith and courage, then you can have the adventure of your life and prevail even over catastrophe. And that's true.
Right.
So,
I couldn't really get my head around why so many young people feel so anxious all the time compared to when I was young, when that wasn't really a big thing amongst my friendship group, certainly. But I reckon it's two things. One, social media, the constant bombardment of other people having a great time or looking great, often a false imagery and that having to live up to false ideals. But also a conversation I had with Dr. Phil in America, where his explanation for it was that he said, you've got to understand that social media means that young people now are being bombarded all day long and all night long with quite shocking imagery. And he gave an example. He said, when I was young, he said, if a crocodile ate somebody on a golf course in Florida, the chances are I would never have heard about it. It probably wouldn't have made the national news, probably wouldn't have even made the state news, and I wouldn't have heard about this incident. Now, it's quite likely that a video of the crocodile eating this person would be whipping its way around social media within half an hour. And young kids would be sharing it, disseminating it, and being exposed to this constant imagery all the time of quite unsettling and shocking imagery. What do you think of that theory? And
I think
that in itself was adding to a sense of everything's terrible.
Well, I think it's a corollary of an information overload theory, right? I mean, one of the advantages to having the computational power we have is that everything is at your fingertips. And the disadvantage is that everything's in your face. And by everything, it might be 40 million pornographic images. Like, that's a lot. Or an endless array of tragic scenarios. And really endless. And so that's a problem. And the fundamental problem is, how do you handle the fire hose of information? And no one really knows the answer to that. But we should also point out that it's no wonder that young people are demoralized and anxious, because we're doing everything we can to demoralize them and make them anxious. So on the masculine front, we tell young boys that, well, the world's a terrible patriarchal tyranny, and all of that patriarchal tyranny, which is the whole explanation for history, has done nothing but oppress and exploit people and destroy the planet. And so that any manifestation of that masculine impulse on your part is equivalent to the world-destroying force.
Most men are not awful, actually. And secondly,
not all the time.
No, some men are, obviously. Some women are pretty awful. But not most of them. But if you try saying that and not getting cancelled. But I think also this thing that you've got into trouble about, which I don't understand why, that you believe that most women probably quite like their men to be strong and confident.
I don't believe that. All the data shows that clearly across cultural samples, and has for 50 years. Plus, everyone knows it.
Anecdotally, most women I know, I think, would absolutely agree. Why is it that you've been so vilified for suggesting something which is so palpably true?
Well, I think, first of all, that annoys narcissistic women no end. And it annoys people who think that there are no biological or cultural limits on how we manifest our behaviors. And also, it frightens a large number of women, because many women have never had a good relationship with anyone masculine in their life. And so the notion that they would need to establish a trusting relationship with a man, especially if he's also in something approximating a superordinate position, which is what they might like to find him maximally attractive, also implies that they're in some sense going to be under his sway. And if there's no trust there, well, that's absolutely terrifying. And I have some sympathy for that, because there are no shortage of women out there who've never had a positive relationship with anyone masculine. And so they're completely unable to discriminate between narcissistic power and compulsion and confident competence. And so because they can't distinguish that, and they're afraid, they put all of that in the same category, which is something like the predator category. And that's not good for them, because, well, as you said, all men aren't predators all the time. And they need to establish a relationship with a man.
Right. We're also in a very strange place where a lot of high-profile women will not say what they think a woman is.
Yeah.
Because they are... Ketanji Brown Jackson, the new member of the Supreme Court, in her nomination hearings, was asked a question. This is what she said.
Can I provide a definition? No.
Yeah.
I can't.
You can't?
Not in this context.
So
I'm not a biologist.
It was a riveting moment, because you're going to be on the Supreme Court of the United States of America. You're a woman. You're the first black woman on the court. And that in itself, I know you've raised eyebrows about, why did Joe Biden go out there and say, we need to have a black woman? Why not just say we want the best person available? And then if she's the best person, get her on the court, which I completely agree with. But for her not to be able to commit to explaining what she thinks a woman is. And then I had a moment on this show where Macy Gray, the singer, did stick her neck out. And she said this.
As a woman,
Just because you go change your parts doesn't make you a woman.
Right.
Sorry.
You feel that?
I know that for a fact. Like, if you want me to call you a her, I will, because that's what you want. But that doesn't make you a woman just because I call you a her and just because you got a surgery.
With chilling predictability, Macy Gray stuck to her guns for a couple of days, and then the onslaught was so overwhelming against her, she had to go on national television in America, issue a groveling apology for everyone that she'd hurt, with this statement of what many would think is just a statement of biological fact. How have we got to this place where women are terrified of saying what a woman is, and women who do say what they think it is, i.e. there are clear biological distinctions between a man and a woman, they get destroyed?
Well, we've accepted this preposterous hypothesis that your identity is only subjectively defined. And as I've tried to point out on some of my in some of my lectures, the only people who think their identity is subjectively defined are 2-year-olds. And I mean that technically, because 2-year-olds are egocentric, which means they can't bring their identity in alignment with a social norm, which also means that 2-year-olds can't play with other children. They can play beside them, but they can't play with them. That doesn't happen until you're 3. And what happens when you're 3, if you're reasonably well socialized or start to move towards that, is that you learn how to negotiate a social identity. And then identity becomes, obviously it has some roots in your subjectivity and in your biology for that matter, but a sophisticated identity is not only socially negotiated, as the constructivists know perfectly well, but it's got a dynamism about it because it has to be constantly renegotiated. Like, as we're having a conversation here, to some degree, we're renegotiating our mutual identities because we learn something from each other, and so we transform. We're also trying to figure out, to some degree, who each of us is in this situation. And then we're also trying to learn, can we play together towards some productive end? And you might ask, well, what do you mean play? And say, well, we're trying to have an interesting conversation.
The royal family and the death of this great queen and the extraordinary outpouring of love and respect, not just here, but around the world, actually. Biggest event of its kind I think I've ever seen. What did you make of it? What do you think of a monarchy in the modern age? Is it survivable?
Well, I thought that what happened was extremely interesting psychologically, because Queen Elizabeth stood for or embodied a whole set of virtues, which is the right way of thinking about it, that aren't in the least bit fashionable, but in fact, they're the inverse of fashionable in some sense, but are desperately needed. And so you might say humility, dutifulness, careful emotional self-regulation, discretion, the antithesis of narcissism, all of that. And she managed it extraordinarily well for 70 years. And so whenever things go too far in one direction, there's a tremendous unconscious or implicit desire for something that would set it right. And that's what you saw happen. And not only on the personal front, but there's also all the pomp and ceremony, which is also archaic and unfashionable. That was all part of that you Brits managed so spectacularly. That was all. People are just dying for that.
The death of the Queen unified us in a way we hadn't been for a long time, certainly since Brexit. No one was talking about hot-button political issues or social issues. They're all talking about one thing. I mean, it also reinforced our national identity.
Oh, yeah.
In a way that actually made the world look on with great awe. It made people feel good about Britain again. And therefore made British people feel good about themselves again.
Yeah, well, you guys have lots to feel good about. And that's not the standard mantra of the modern world. You know, this is an unbelievably admirable country for all its flaws. And so...
What do you find admirable about us?
English common law, the tradition of free speech, sardonic and self-effacing humor that's so much a part of the culture,
our ability to queue for 13 hours
politely
to see a woman lying in state who's not even a member of our family.
Right. Well, and to
resilience,
well, and to do that peacefully, and to do that in a spirit of mutual goodwill, and come to a place like London. It's unbelievably ethnically diverse, and yet it functions extraordinarily well. And
what are your best traits, and what are the worst traits of Dr. Jordan Peterson?
Well, I think that it's been difficult for me to optimally regulate my irritation at times over the last few years. And I'm trying to get that right, to figure out what the right, because a lot of things that have happened have outraged me. And then I'm not exactly sure what emotional tone to take as a consequence of that outrage. And that's a very complicated thing to figure out. And that's been exacerbated, that problem, by the fact that my family and I have been the targets of very conniving and attacks and underground attacks. And that isn't stopping. I mean,
Another time when your wife was fighting a deadly cancer.
Yeah, and
which is
my
deadly in
daughter was
most
sick,
cases.
and so was I. So
Yeah.
yeah. So it's very difficult to regulate your temper properly under those circumstances, let's say. And so I don't imagine.
Where
that
have
I've
you
always
most
done that
improved
well.
yourself, do you think, as you've got older?
I get better and better at listening.
One of my sons, two of my sons have come today because they just wanted to listen to this. Very unusual. One of them's not even been to the studio before. So he just said to me, I said, give me some advice. You know, you love Jordan Peterson. What's the advice for the interview? He said, just listen more than you normally do. So I've tried hard to ask a question and let you answer.
Right.
And so I'm work in progress. And I've been
Yeah.
interviewing people for 35 years. But I do think the listening, as I've got older, I felt the same thing. That
Yeah, it's a real skill, man.
Listening is a powerful tool, actually.
Oh yeah. Well, there is nothing that people like more and need more than to be listened to. You know, and that's partly why the left clamors all the time. You know, it says, look, there's all these people who aren't being listened to. It's like, there are a lot of people who aren't being listened to. They're absolutely right. There's no doubt about that. And I've dealt with people who were extraordinarily marginalized, so to speak, in my clinical practice. And some of those people, to straighten out their minds, they need like 10,000 hours of listening. Because no one, and I mean this literally, I've had people in my clinical practice, no one ever listened to them their whole life.
Yeah.
And so when they start talking, they're all over the place, they're disorganized, they're hyper emotional.
Having met me now for an hour, what would your initial clinical diagnosis be?
Well, you're probably optimally disagreeable for your profession, you know, because you can listen, but you're also not a pushover. And that's a very fine line, right? Because if you're too assertive or aggressive, then you get domineering, but if you're not enough, then you're a pushover. And a lot of the journalists who've gone after me in some sense have that. They think, there's part of them that thinks, I'll be the person that finally exposes him for what he is.
Yeah.
But then they find out that I'm not who they thought that I am, or at least I'm not quite as demonic as they thought I might be.
Well, Professor Stephen Hawking, before he died, gave me his last television interview, and he said that the biggest threat to the future of mankind was when artificial intelligence learned to self-design. What do you think the biggest threat to mankind is?
Narcissistic compassion. Now AIs, you know, it's a threat too, but if we had our act together ethically, it's possible that AI could become a useful servant rather than a tyrannical master. You don't want to automate your tyrannical masters. And that's the danger. That's one of the dangers of AI.
I've got to wrap it up. I don't want to, but I have to. I want to ask you just quickly, the film director Olivia Wilde has a new movie out, which she says is based on you, this insane man, this pseudo-intellectual hero to the incel community. Incel being these weirdo loner men who are despicable in many ways. Is that you? Are you the intellectual hero to these people?
Sure, why not? You know, people have been after me for a long time because I've been speaking to disaffected young men. You know, what a terrible thing to do that is. I thought the marginalized were supposed to have a voice.
It's making you emotional to talk about that.
Well, God, you know, it's very difficult to understand how demoralized people are. And certainly many young men are in that category. And you get these casual insults, these incels. What does it mean? It's like, well, these men, they don't know how to make themselves attractive to women who are very picky, and good for them. Women, like, be picky. That's your gift, man. Demand high standards from your men. Fair enough. But all these men who are alienated, it's like, they're lonesome and they don't know what to do, and everyone piles abuse on them.
When she said that, Olivia Wilde, it stung you, didn't it? I saw the
Oh, by
reaction.
that time, you know, that as far as critiques go, that was kind of low level. I mean, once I got painted as Red Skull, you know, magical super Nazi, that was kind of the end of the insults. There's no place past that. So when Olivia Wilde made those comments, the first thing I did was go look at the preview for a movie, which I quite liked. I thought I would go see that movie probably, and perhaps I will. It didn't really bother me. My family and I talked about it right away, and we were able to respond to it with some degree of humor, which then people completely misunderstood. I said I hope that, you know, that if I had to be played by someone, he's a very good-looking man, and so that seems all right, you know. And then I said something like, I hope he gets my fashion style choice right when he plays me. And it was a joke. All that was a joke.
I mean, you've been so controlled today, and yet in that brief moment, you got very emotional. Why?
It's really something to see constantly how many people are dying for lack of an encouraging word. And how easy it is to provide that if you're careful. You know, give credit where credit is due. And to say, you're a net force for good if you want to be.
Do you believe you're a net force for good?
Net, yes. In all the details, probably not. You know, no one's perfect. So people make their mistakes as they stumble uphill.
Jordan, it's been a fascinating interview. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've got this new box set out.
Yeah, I'm pretty happy about that.
Jordan B. Peterson, 24 Rules for Life and Beyond Order. Fascinating books. They've sold how many millions now?
Well, 12 Rules sold 7, and I think Beyond Order is approaching 1 million now. So yeah, they're doing just fine.
Did you ever think you'd sell that number of books?
I never thought any of this would happen, you know, I mean, so yeah, I knew when I was teaching at Harvard and at the University of Toronto that some of the things I was teaching were revolutionary. I was surprised that I got away with it, let's say, as long as I did. And so there's a way in which it doesn't surprise me. And I wouldn't say that's because of the brilliance of my ideas. It's because I'm good at communicating ideas, but the ideas that I've been developing, they're ancient ideas. They're the oldest ideas we have in some real sense. So they have a power.
Right, absolutely. And just finally, you're healthy, you look healthy.
Pretty good.
And
Much better.
Your wife's doing a lot better than she was?
She's back better than she was before even. And my daughter's not ill either. So fancy that.
I mean, that's an amazing turnaround from where you were.
That's
as a
for
family.
sure, man. It was pretty brutal.
Yeah.
For a long time.
Yeah.
You know, my wife almost died every day for 7 months. So
I'm very glad for you.
thank you, sir.
I really am. It's been a really fascinating interview.
Appreciate
really
the
enjoyed
time.
it. Come back.
It's a pleasure to see
I
you.
feel like we've got a million more things I could talk to you about, which I'm sure everyone thinks that when they talk to you.
Well, that's a good thing to have happen during an interview.
Jordan, thank you.
You bet, man.
Whatever you think of Jordan Peterson, you can't listen to that and not be enthralled, captivated, maybe challenged, maybe you don't agree with him. I'm not sure he minds if you disagree with him. That's the whole point. It's about stimulating ideas. It's about challenging what you believe.